Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. In this video, we will be talking about scopes and permissions related to Azure Active Directory. So let's get started. So typically in Azure Active Directory, as I've mentioned earlier, Microsoft Identity Platform uses the OAuth 2.0 authorization protocol. Now in OAuth 2.0 authorization protocol, when you typically have a resource server, which can be either a Microsoft created resource, which can be like graph.microsoft.com, or it can be management.azure.com, or it can be vault.azure.net. So any of this API, which is a web hosted API, they are configured to use Azure AD as an identity provider. However, it can also be the case that there are some third party APIs which also use Azure AD as an authentication and authorization provider. Now, in this case, how the authorization and authentication happens is through with the form of access tokens. Now, each access token, basically the user with the help of the client provides this access token to the resource server. And this access token is basically a JWT token. Now, this JWT token, which is also called as JSON Web Token, is a JSON object containing several fields. Like the ID, the user principal name of the user, the tenant of the user, and one of the most important parts, which is a part and parcel of a JWT, is something called as a scope. So the scope is what defines what this token can actually be used to do. And along with the scope, there is also another parameter called AUD, which is called audience. Now, AUD defines where it can be used or to which destination this is destined to. And scope is what defines what can be done with this token. Now, the reason why this is created is if just imagine that you have created an application which basically is something like a cooking application. Now, in this application, what you will do is a user who is basically going to use your application signs in using IDP, which is AAD, and uses this token to access one node. And this information is basically taken by the resource provider, which is your application. Now, in this case, the token is specifically created to access the user's one node nodes. However, just imagine that this token is stolen either in transit, or it is compromised at the end of the user, or it is compromised at your resource provider, the way you're storing the token. Now, in this case, this token cannot be used to access users' email or Teams information, or it cannot be used to basically authenticate and do actions with users' Azure account. If the user is a privileged administrator, even then these cannot be performed. However, the attacker will yes have access to one node. So scopes play a very important role in defining what the token is capable of doing. Now, very common APIs that you would see in inside the permissions are something that you can actually see in the Azure portal itself. When you go to applications and when you click on any application over here, you would have something called as API permissions. Now, this API permissions will have a list of all the permissions that this application has access to. Now, we will talk about what delegated versus application permission is in a bit, but to add a permission or to review the permission from a security perspective, this is how you can do it. Now, what are the commonly used Microsoft APIs is what you would see here. For example, Graph is something that you have a whole ton of APIs. Now, here is a Microsoft Graph Explorer. Here you can see that Microsoft Graph Explorer can actually be used to manage Teams or basically get information about Teams, Microsoft To Do, OneDrive, OneNote, Outlook, Outlook Email, Outlook Mail Beta, etc., etc., and even SharePoint as well. Now, what this means is anything within Microsoft Graph API should also have fine-grained permission. So it can't just be graph.microsoft.com. Now, we've discussed this use case of, hey, if this token is compromised, this can be used to access other parts, right? I mean, only one node, but not mail or Teams. This is where the structure of a scope comes into the picture. A structure of a scope would be something like HTTPS, that URL of the web API URL, and the path which actually contains the entire permission. Now, by default, whenever you're trying to use something like, if you want to do a read of a user, if you want to read the user permission, it will be something .user.read. And if it is something like Outlook, it would just be like Outlook dot, mail dot read or something like that. I think generally it'll just be mail dot read, or it'll be mail dot write. So if a token contains a scope of graph.microsoft.com, or let me just rewrite it over here. If it contains https graph.microsoft.com slash mail.read, then it means this can only be used to read an email. It cannot be used to read the OneNote of that particular user. Now, this is actually what I mean by fine-grained permissions. When you go to Microsoft Graph and when you click on delegated permission, you see, hey, I want to read the user's email address and I want to view the user's basic profile. And when you click on add permissions, you would see that there is a new section, or basically new thing added, profile. And this email is what it will give you, that you can view user's email ID, and you can read about a specific user, or you can basically read about all the users, etc. Now, this is how you can evaluate a security. You can evaluate the security posture of an application. Now, coming back to the different type of permission, we were talking about delegated versus application. Now, there are two major type of authentication credential flows that generally happen. The first one is user interactive type, wherein a user gives a permission for the application to interact with the target resource. And the second one is the application itself does this. So it is called application initiated. Now, there are several flows in user initiated. Some of them are auth grant flow, auth code grant flow, device code flow, and implicit flow, or resource password sharing flow. Or we also have on behalf flow as well. And in this case, in the application initiated, we have something called as client credential flow. Now, the major difference, as the name indicates, is in this first one, it is user interactive, and the second one, it is application initiated. When in user interactive, there is a user who will go to an application which is Azure, or let's say he or she goes to a resource provider. The resource provider says, hey, use this application which is in Azure AD to log in. And when the entire authentication process gets completed, the authentication happens through this application, and this application gives permission, or basically sends an authentication token for the user to present to the resource provider. Let me repeat again. What the user does is he or she uses this application to log in into a resource provider. But in application initiated, there is no user interaction. So the user simply configures an application, and this application time and again uses its credentials to talk to the resource provider. So this will just act as if it's another identity. It's as if another user, it generally talks to the resource provider. Now, let me take an example, and let me, sort of categorize these two. For example, when you typically click on, log in with Microsoft, or log in with Google, or log in with something else, and you do an authentication process, this is what happens when you do that. However, if you're a developer, you pretty much know that there are instances where your application itself, like your code needs to talk to your specific resource provider, which is, let's say, Azure. So you have, let's say, created an application that will talk to Azure on a regular basis for, let's say, every 5 minutes, and it is going to check a billing status, and it's going to see what is the current budget that is allocated, or it just wants to fetch something from Azure. But there is no user interaction associated to this, associated with the entire flow. This is when you would use client credentials as a part of this particular flow. Now, a very major part of of both these flows are something called as certificate and secrets. Now, here there are two types of authentication that the application does. Now, if you see in a typical in a user initiated flow as well, the resource provider is actually trusting this application, which is, although it is sitting in AAD, it is trusting this application. And even here, the resource provider is trusting your application, basically to sort of give you either the token or to use its credentials. In this case, we have something called as client ID and client secret for the very same reason. So here, when you inside Azure AD, we have something called as client ID. The client ID is basically an overview, which is present as application ID. And in client secrets, you have either a certificate-based authentication or you have a secret-based authentication. How it is used in a bigger picture in detail, we'll be talking about in the next video. But the idea is that these are something which is which can be which can be treated as a password for a user identity. So if this is lost, it just means that the application is now compromised. So whenever you hear the term called application is compromised, this is what it is.